All right, so thanks for the introduction, Barry and Dave. Like Dave mentioned, this is a result of my lab rotation in the Polymorphic Game Studio, and my title today is Survival of the Hairiest, Mate Selection in an Evolutionary Video Game. So we're talking about video games, and I thought it would be distracting to have a bunch of different videos on every slide, so I wanted to create kind of a 1-minute introduction to the game for you guys to watch first. So let's do that.
Welcome to Evolving Bugs Pew Pew! In this game, you pilot a ship and attempt to eliminate aliens that are mercilessly shooting at you. Sounds simple enough, right? Maybe, but after a while you realize that the aliens are getting harder to kill. What's going on here? The aliens' secret weapon is that they have an evolving genome. Let me give you some examples of how this changes the game. If you use only one type of weapon, the aliens evolve to be resistant to it. If you're always targeting aliens that behave a certain way, they evolve to choose that behavior less often in order to survive longer. This video game is already exciting because it's a space shooter, but when you add the interaction between the actions of the player and the evolving genome of the enemies, it becomes something magical.
Okay, so everybody should be all in on this video game, right? But then the question...
Wait, Kristen, wait. I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but that was the single greatest video in the history of the game studio.
Oh, thanks, Barry. I can offer my services anytime.
I'll second that.
Thanks, Terry. Appreciate it. So now that we're all excited about this video game, the question that you might be asking is, why should we use video games to study evolution in the first place? We have regular animals to look at, right? Well, video games are interesting and different from traditional simulations because the fitness emerges from the video game itself. So based on what the player does, the organisms evolve in different ways. And traditional simulations require these to be exact specifications. So this is something that's really cool about video games specifically. So this game kind of already exists, right? So what exactly did I do here? Well, I added mate selection to this video game. So our next question is, what is mate selection to begin with? So mate selection is when an animal assesses a potential mate to see if they're good enough to mate with. And one of the most classic examples of this is Fisherian runaway, which is when mate choice imposes this strong directional selection on an ornamental trait. And so a couple of the biggest examples of this are male peacock feathers, as well as I wanted to have some invertebrate representation here with a peacock spider as well. And so this sort of runaway selection results in dramatic ornamentation, like I mentioned, but this might be detrimental to these organisms. So a male peacock might have trouble flying because of the massive feathers behind it, and it creates this air drag, right? And so the question here in the literature that we see a lot is, because it's detrimental, is this a sort of rare phenomenon? And that's something that I figured it's got to be rare, right? Because it's got this detrimental effect. But being chosen by females is like the coolest thing to have happen to you as an organism, right? And so we're using a video game here, though, to break empirical barriers. So in real life, it's hard to see what a female might interact or what a female might think about different males. And so using this simulation allows us to see exactly with numbers how females feel about certain males without having to see a real mating event. So the key questions here are, can we successfully add mate selection to the video game? And I thought, yes. The second question here is, will classic Fisherian runaway selection happen on its own? And after looking at the literature and talking to Adam Jones, I realized that no, this can't happen by itself. You're going to need some parameters to make it happen. And then our third question is, if female preference is allowed to evolve, what happens? And my assumption here is that as female preference evolves, so does the attractiveness trait. So again, our study system is Evolving Bugs Pew Pew, our evolutionary space shooter game. In this game, there's a generational model, and so you might be familiar with other video games that have a checkpoint system. Well, in this game, the checkpoints are generations. And so every checkpoint, there's 100 different aliens that appear, and as you kill them, once you've killed 100, you go to the next generation. And the next aliens are created by the previous generation's aliens. But there's this, there are these mating pools. And so if you have a good enough fitness, you'll be able to go inside these pools to then mate to create the next generation. And like I mentioned before, the selective pressure is created by the player. So if you're killing a certain kind of alien, those ones will appear less often because they will be less fit. And the reason why I say they will be less fit is because the fitness function here is survivability. So the longer they survive, the more fit they are. And then in this case, the mutation rate has to be very high because I'm only running this for about 50 generations. And in order to have something interesting happen with the genome, you need to have a high mutation rate when you have that low of a generation size. And then mate selection specifically, a female is chosen based on a roulette, and I can talk more about that if anybody's interested about that. But then the male is chosen based on female preference for hairiness, because as we know, the most attractive males are the hairiest males. And so here is a sort of assemblage of males to sort of show the degree of hairiness that can happen. So on the far left, we have a not very hairy male. That one would not be chosen very often. We've got a sort of mid-tier male here with some hair, but the right-hand side, like this is the male that you want. This is the prime specimen, the hairiest male. And so these are the ones that the females are choosing a lot of the time. And so I didn't want to play this game a whole bunch. It's a very fun game, but it's kind of hard to play sometimes. I died a lot, and so we have an AI player. And this AI player is sort of the most standard version of it, is that it avoids projectiles, it stays close to the enemies, and it targets the closest alien about 40% of the time, and then 60% of the time it does a random one. We have a couple of other AI players, one that's more aggressive and one that's more cautious, but right now we're just using the regular one. And so for our experiments, all of them, we did all these experiments with fitness on and off, and then mate selection on and off to see what the different sort of effects of each of those things were on our experiments. And so the first thing we did was Fisherian selection using the parameters in Henshaw and Jones' 2019 paper that sort of broke down the classic Fisherian selection into an actual equation, which was really cool. And so in this paper, we saw that the desired trait should always be increasing and the attractive trait should have no cost. And so those are the parameters that I used in the video game for this. And then our last experiment is to see what happens when the female preference evolves. And so to look at some results, this was probably the most exciting thing that happened beyond the video game, is that everything worked exactly as I thought it should. So when we have mate selection on, regardless of if fitness is on or off, we have this attractiveness trait just skyrocketing throughout the generations. And so this shows that the attractiveness trait does not depend on fitness at all. It depends entirely on the mate selection, which is great. And then when we turn mate selection off, we get all this wiggly wobbly drift. And so this is also exactly what we wanted to see. We did not want to see that fitness had any impact on it. And we wanted to see that mate selection was the only driver of attractiveness. Then for our other experiment that we did where the female preference evolves, this is a little harder to show across all of the replicates that we did. So this is just one replicate here. But the idea is that the desired trait, which is here in teal, is what is driving this attractiveness trait, no matter where it goes. And so you can see that the attractiveness is closely following the desired trait. And that's exactly what we wanted to see. So basically this shows that whatever sort of hairiness that the females prefer is the hairiness that the males evolve. And so to conclude, Evolving Bugs serves as an excellent model of both evolution and mate selection. And the Polymorphic Game Studio really focuses on trying to get these games used in classrooms. And so this is definitely a game that you could use in classrooms. Additionally, mate selection is working as we hoped it would after reading all sorts of literature about it. As we've shown here, that runaway selection just doesn't come up on its own. You do have to actually program for it, but it's still cool to be able to see it in the game when we do program for it. And then the next sort of step here for me is to see if directional selection imposed by female choice decreases genetic variance in fitness. This is part of a greater thing called the Leck paradox, which I don't really want to spend the time to talk about because it's very complex, but this is the sort of thing that I want to see, like what does mate selection do to the rest of the fitness and the rest of the genes of these organisms? And so I just wanted to acknowledge the BCB program and the Department of Biological Sciences for funding, as well as the Polymorphic Game Studio magicians, including Barry, Terry, Landon, Lily, Graham, and Parker. They're all incredible people, and they were lots of fun to work with last semester, as well as my lab, the Harmon Lab, and then the Snorks. You know who you are. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to just shoot.
Oh, Zoom applause is so awkward, right? So, Kristen, I mean, mate selection might be pretty complicated to sort of get into classrooms at anything except maybe advanced, like high school biology, right? I would think. I don't, or undergraduates. But what do you think we have to do in order? I mean, you have to actually get your hooks in deep to the model to get the data to run these experiments. What do we have to do to actually make it so that somebody could use this and actually learn something without your knowledge?
Well, I think that, so the reason why we chose hairiness is that it's this sort of charismatic trait that you can see. And so as you're playing the game, like the males do start to look hairier. And so I think that using that sort of visual thing would be useful for any sort of classroom, just like to show that, to say generally that the females are choosing hairier males, and then this choice is what makes them more hairy. Like, I think that sort of surface level thing would be good for the classroom, certainly. And then if you really want to get deep into it, you could look at the numbers, but I don't think it's super necessary.
And so just following up on that, so as you're playing the game as it is right now, you have no idea this is going on. I mean, as a regular player, right? I think what Barry's getting at. Okay.
Yeah, but if you're like paying extra super attention to what the aliens look like, you might notice, but yeah.
But you don't know why, right?
Right, yeah.
And so I know Amanda asked the question and then said question answered, but maybe I was spacing out. So what's the cost to the aliens to get hairy?
So there is no cost right now for the Fisherian selection. In fact, there's been a lot of talk in my office actually on the blackboard of like how to create a cost to make this model happen. And like, no matter what I do, the cost does not work. And so it's a little frustrating for that. So right now we're doing no cost, but we'll see what happens later.
That's the flip side of using a game as a simulation, right? Like, how do you make the player shoot hairier, aliens? It's a thing that's now out of your control. So
right,
cost is hard.
Well, they get bigger. I assume their target is easier to hit, but maybe not substantially, apparently.
Everybody knows that hairier aliens, though, are more resistant to damage, Dave. It's a trade-off, come on.
I mean, can the cost be something like speed? I mean, it's...
Yes, so
like real birds or something, like, I mean, the idea is that like a peacock is less agile than a, robin or something.
Right, yeah.
Some cumbersome thing that slows them down.
We've tried speed several different ways, and it just didn't do anything.
Because natural selection stopped the runaway?
So what ends up happening is that like the speed decreases, but not enough that it does anything. Like the AI player doesn't target those aliens more often. And so the runaway selection just keeps happening regardless.
Since it is an AI player, if you wanted for the player to target hairier aliens, it would be pretty easy to just put that into the AI in this.
Yeah, we could do that too. What I wanted was to do it based on the genetics though, instead of based on the AI player, but we might have to do the AI player instead.
I think we're getting ready for the transition to the next speaker, right, Dave? Like these are sort of 20-minute windows.
Yeah, okay. We got a couple minutes if other people have questions. I see Benji just put one in the chat there.
Oh yeah, that'd be a good last question for you, Kristen.
Wow. Okay, so the question is, what if the trait was transparency? Human players at least wouldn't be able to see them as readily. The more preferred male would be brighter. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I guess mostly I hadn't thought about it because we don't use human players to test the games and like to get the data. But that's definitely something that we could try. Sounds cool. What do you think, Landon?
That would be really fun. At some point before we release the game, it would be cool if we could do some human experiments with it.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you thought about sort of citizen science kind of things here, like putting this out into a bunch of classrooms and or in the high school and having all of Luke's kids' friends playing it?
Yeah,
as your, to get your data.
Yeah. We actually had some momentum there in terms of some teachers in Lewiston before COVID blew everything up in our lives. And So yes, that would be wonderful. It's just that too many cool things to do and not enough brain power to do it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what a pre-COVID polymorphic game studio experience is yet. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Kristen. That's super cool.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for listening. It was fun.